All right. Hello, everyone. It's just past 9 p.m. here in Tel Aviv, just after 2 p.m. on the US East Coast, where we are hearing that there are some internet outage problems. But regardless, we will begin our session. Thank you very much for joining Zoom with Haaretz. This is the first session that we are doing, the first briefing we are doing since the Biden administration took over Washington, D.C. We had a lot of sessions leading up to the US election. I think we did one right after Joe Biden was elected. And now we are beginning a conversation about a new era in Washington, D.C. and in the Middle East. A new president, a new administration, but still some old problems are with us. To discuss those issues today, we have with us two great Haaretz panelists. Alon Pinkas. Alon, can say hi to the camera. Just joined us at Haaretz a few weeks ago as our senior analyst on US and Israeli affairs. Before joining us, Alon had a long career as a writer in different media outlets and a commentator, but also as a diplomat, was the Israeli consul general in New York and worked for foreign ministers and prime ministers. Great to have you with us, Alon. You are joining us from Tel Aviv, but I see that in spirit, you are on the White House lawn, maybe preparing for the signing of the next peace accords between Israel and some Arab states. We'll get to that later. And from Jerusalem, joining us this evening, Alison Kaplan-Sommer, senior writer and analyst with Haaretz, writing about US and Israeli affairs, the Jewish community. Those of you who are subscribers to Haaretz probably enjoyed Alison's great reporting from the United States during the election. We really enjoyed having her stories from the ground in different swing states and writing about different Jewish communities. Great to have you with us, Alison. We're going to talk for about an hour, and we will also have time for questions from the audience. We do have a slight issue with the chat, as some of you maybe have noticed. There is, as I said earlier, there are some very fine people who are operating in our chat and spreading messages of love and harmony. Hopefully our technical team will take care of that, solve it, and then all of our other viewers will actually be able to submit questions through the Q&A and the chat buttons, one thing at a time. Alon, I want to start with you. The main topic we're going to discuss today is what we have called Biden's dangerous inheritance, what he is inheriting from the previous president in the Middle East, and specifically on the Iranian issue. A lot of headlines on that subject in the recent days and even hours. What is Biden receiving in the handoff from the Trump administration on the Iranian issue?
Well, look, if you look at the general inheritance, he's not getting much, neither good nor bad. But there's one issue that sticks out, and that is obviously the JCPOA, aka the Iran nuclear deal. The U.S., as everyone on this conversation, on this Zoom talk or webinar knows and remembers, the U.S. unilaterally withdrew from that agreement. And despite then President Trump and still Prime Minister Netanyahu's contentions to the contrary, the agreement did not disappear with the U.S.'s withdrawal. It remained intact until about 8 months ago, when the Iranians breached and violated the things or the issues, particularly the enrichment of uranium. So that's probably the number one inheritance that will require the president's attention and his team's attention. And the dilemma, I'll say it in one sentence because we could go back to this in a moment. The dilemma is very simple. Basically the incoming Biden-Blinken administration, I'll call it Blinken administration because he's the Secretary of State, confirmed today, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, just a short while ago.
Just a short while ago, that's right. They're faced with three options, none of which is easy, none of which, all three of which have pros and cons. One is to stay out of the agreement and to negotiate quietly a new agreement, a so-called improved agreement. Whether that could be achieved or not, whether that's feasible or not, I have no answer at this point. Probably not, but I can't base this on anything. The second possibility, the second policy option is to go back to the agreement as the US re-entered the Paris Climate Accord or other agreements that it will go back into, and then negotiate a return to the status quo ante that existed before Trump pulled out the US. That's not feasible. The third option is to start hard diplomatic negotiations with the allies. Let's not forget, one of Trump's inheritances is unilateralism.
America
Biden,
first and alone.
well, yeah, America first is a great T-shirt, but it's nonsense. It was never America first. It was all about Trump. But let's not get into that. And some of the things that Trump said made sense, except for the fact that they were never backed by policy. So it was just about him tweeting at 3 a.m. But one of the inheritances was a total dismissal and derision of alliances and consultations and so on. The JCPOA will require going back to negotiate not only with Britain and France and Germany, but also with China and Russia. And that has other facets and implications. So in general, Biden is inheriting a Middle East which is pretty tranquil. Not, I'm serious. No.
Amir, you can't hold it back, can you?
Listen, as someone who lives here, I can see the tranquility. But Alon,
well, if you zoom out for a second and look at the Middle East from 30,000 or 40,000 feet, the Middle East is a relatively quiet place right now. I'm not talking about people being killed in Yemen or Syria. That's always been the case. I'm not dismissing, I'm not belittling, and I'm not saying that's not important. But in terms of the potential spillover and escalation, Biden is inheriting an ideal Middle East, one which he need not concern himself with, aside from the JCPOA.
Yeah, that's the biggest issue that he's still going to have to solve, the biggest headache. And Ellison, turning over to you, what is the team that he's bringing with him to try to work on this issue? Alon mentioned the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. Who are the main people that are going to be tasked with this very serious file that, again, for us in Israel is probably going to be the biggest one, going forward with this administration?
Right. Well, it's very important to look at the team, because really, the band is back together again when it comes to the JCPOA, when it comes to the Iran agreement. We had some breaking news that the Israeli, the IDF chief of staff, Aviv Kochavi, spoke out very strongly against the U.S. returning to the agreement, saying that nothing. He didn't just say let's not go back to the agreement. He said nothing that even resembles the JCPOA, and considering the people that are now leading foreign policy in the Biden administration, that's a lot of wishful thinking, because these are the people that put blood, sweat, tears, hours, who must be very personally invested in that.
It's their agreement in a way.
It's their baby, exactly. So I'll just to run down the list. The heavily involved in the negotiation were, nominees. They're all nominees, but I'll just say their future titles: National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, CIA Director William Burns, Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, and National Security Advisor to the Vice President Philip Gordon. They were all involved in the actual negotiation themselves. And at the top, we've got Secretary of State nominee. He's not nominee anymore. Now he's the Secretary of State, we call him, right? Blinken, he played a leading role in getting the deal through Congress. He was out there, pushing the deal and, making the case for it in Congress. So to think that they are not go back to anything even resembling that deal is a lot of wishful thinking, and seems not to augur well for any possible harmony between the Israeli position and the U.S. position.
Along this team that Ellison just mentioned, the Obama band back together on this issue at least. What do you think is going through their head when they see this evening, as Ellison mentioned, the chief of staff of the Israeli military, Aviv Kochavi, basically taking a position publicly against returning to the nuclear deal, saying that it's a bad idea strategically and tactically, and really, making headlines about this?
Well, okay, so let's divide this into two. First of all, about the team. Let's not forget two people that Allison did not mention because it was taken for granted. I'll mention them now. The first one is Joe Biden, the president of the United States, who was the vice president when the negotiations took place. So he's invested in this process. And during the time, there were two stages in Congress, one getting it through and one preventing Congress, then the Republicans, from gaining a veto-proof or overriding the president's veto, which was unsuccessful. Biden played a role in both cases. The second person, I think, is going to be key, and that's Rob Malley. Rob Malley, who was not directly involved in the negotiations, but was always in the background, is not an Obama leftover, but a Bill Clinton peace process, and he's now peace process leftover, so to speak. And he's now been appointed, again, not confirmed, he's been appointed as the Iran envoy. And I think he's going to have a crucial impact on how the US devises this policy. So I totally agree with what Allison said. There are going to be three people who are going to be dealing with this, I think. Secretary of State Blinken, National Security Advisor Sullivan, and Iran envoy Rob Malley. They will then channel this to the president. Again, the way policy is made in DC, the CIA is going to be involved.
The way policy is usually made in DC, that's not
the way policy was
the
made.
last 4 years.
The way policy was correct. The way policy used to be made doesn't necessarily make it a good policy, but in terms of the structure and the flow.
And then when Israel, it's not just Netanyahu now, the chief of staff makes this kind of statement. How does that impact their thinking?
So let me tell you, it impacts zero. And I'll tell you something. I'll be purposely blunt to accommodate all our viewers. What the chief of staff, assuming the quote is accurate, that he thinks, and let me read it out, that going back to the agreement is a bad and improper decision. Now, let's divide this into two. First of all, it is absolutely not his place to say this. He is the chief of staff. He's not the prime minister. He's not the foreign minister. He's not even the defense minister. He's the chief of staff. He's a lieutenant general. He's wearing a uniform. It's none of his business to butt into and meddle into American decision making. If he had something to say, he would have been better advised to call his interlocutor in Washington, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, and express his reservations, or put himself on a flight, provided there are flights, and go to Washington and explain this, his reservations. To say that this is a bad deal publicly, it just sets up an unnecessary confrontation with an incoming administration. It's actually, we're not going to start counting the statements, but just 10 days ago, or less than 10 days ago, retired Major General Benjamin Amidro, who was the National Security Advisor.
Yaakov
Amidro. I called him Jacob for the sake of our viewers. Yaakov Amidro made an even more far-reaching statement, saying that if the Americans go back to the JCPOA, to the same agreement that they had left 2.5 years ago, that would mean that Israel has to seriously ponder and consider and contemplate a military action. Okay, that's a lot of bravado backed by nothing. And I wish he didn't say it, but he's entitled to. He's in a think tank, and he's entitled to do his thinking and his talking and try to influence policy. When the chief of staff says something like this, when there is basically not a word from the defense minister, not a word from the foreign minister, but all in the context of an election coming up on the 23rd of March, and Iran being a good opportunity for Mr. Netanyahu to show his superhuman abilities to deal with the world on the Iran issue, excuse my my language, that is a poor statement, because it starts off what should have been discreet, honest, and credible negotiations between Israel and the U.S. It's almost reminiscent, Amir, of the 2014 setting and circumstances, when Israel was essentially invited to sit around the table and instead chose to confront Obama and go behind his back, and that culminated in March of 2015 when he went to speak to Congress. Yep. I'm telling you know, I'm not telling you this is going to happen again, but I would not be surprised if Mr. Netanyahu will try and pull something like this again.
But would he be able to, Ellison, with the current setting in Washington?
Well, that's what I was going to point out, that, you know, 2015 is not 2021. So, you know, first and foremost, we've got Democrats controlling the entire Congress. So he's not going to be able to pull what Netanyahu is not going to able to come close to doing what he did in 2015 when behind the back of the Obama White House, which like pretty much stunned them. They couldn't believe that he did it. He came and he made his speech to Congress. And in case anyone forgot, we're in a pandemic. So, you know, we're in a pandemic and he's running. He's got a campaign to maintain. So he can't go, you know, in many ways, he can't go flitting off to Washington to wave his magic wand and put on the Netanyahu show and do his thing anymore. So, you know, he's got a lot of, you know, his hands are tied behind his back. Just in regard to what Kochavi said, and, you know, that it was very surprising to see that headline just now. In the, you know, back in the day in 2014-15, when we had Netanyahu coming out, you know, very publicly and grandstanding against the agreement, there were these like whispering voices in the background from the Israeli military establishment who were saying, you know, on background, off the record to the press, that the agreement might not be so bad for Israel. So, you know, in the context of that having happened, to have someone in the military who inappropriately, as Alon said, you know, publicly speaks out like this on a political matter, it shows that Netanyahu, I guess, is literally rallying the troops to his cause this time around.
Yeah, that is definitely a different dynamic. I just want to point out to our viewers, and we have many people joining us and sending questions. You can use the Q&A and the chat button to send questions. Yeah, we have, I see once again some, I will use the phrase, yeah, friends, very fine people, wonderful people with some smart comments, but we will ignore it. Ellison, another quick question regarding the election. How much of an issue is this right now on the election agenda in Israel? I mean, is this what, you know, this is something that a lot of times, you know, you see from the United States, a discussion about these strategic issues, but how much does it play into the current political dynamic in the country here?
I would say somewhere between very little to not at all. I mean, people have their eyes on the local crisis, which is the coronavirus pandemic. That's what they care about, and they care about in the accompanying economic disaster. And there is almost no bandwidth on this matter. But, you know, to the extent that it would influence anybody, everyone will remember how our highways were plastered with billboards of Netanyahu, you know, being chummy with President Donald Trump. One of his selling points was how well he got along with and how well he could influence the direction of the U.S. president. So if he does decide to go to the route of confrontation, you know, public clash with Biden, everybody's going to be pointing that out. So it really is going to be a crossroads for Netanyahu in this campaign decision. I don't know, Alon, maybe you can already sense which way he's going with it, whether he's going to go the route of only I can nicely behind the scenes in a diplomatic way influence the direction of the Biden White House, or only I have the master skills to confront the matter and really go to war and fight for your security in Washington, D.C.
So Alon, I want to take Ellison's question and add a layer to it. Joe Biden used to say in the past that he and Bibi, as he called him, Bibi Netanyahu, have been friends for decades. I remember the vice presidential debate in 2012, Joe Biden and Paul Ryan, and Paul Ryan began to attack the Obama administration on its Israel record, and Biden kind of pounded on the table and said, I've been friends with Bibi Netanyahu for 40 years. You're not going to teach me about Israel. Do you think he still wants to manage this relationship with Netanyahu from the position of we are friends, we can talk this over?
Well, it's consistent with how he conducts his political business. With him, it was always throughout his career. It was all about dialogue and compromise and getting along and ironing out the differences and the no daylight cliche. But let's put it in a timetable. Until May, there's no reason for him to confront Netanyahu. Netanyahu could do and say whatever he wants on the Iran, and he could be right and he could be wrong and he could be vociferous, or he could be discreet. It doesn't matter. Until there is a new government in Israel, which is not before May, there's absolutely no reason for the Biden administration to confront Netanyahu. Do not cater to his political or
don't help him change the situation that Ellison described, that this is not an issue in the election.
And exactly. And secondly, do not turn this into an issue inside Washington. I mean, what is the purpose? This is a president that needs to deal with a huge pandemic, with a massive and colossal failure in preparing America for vaccination, with tremendous and huge economic, excuse me for using Trump-like words, but they really are tremendous and huge economic, huge ramifications. And the last thing he needs right now is a confrontation supposedly with an ally. But let's not be naive here. If Netanyahu keeps on trying to bicker and to try and draw and tempt and seduce the administration into some kind of what he believes to be a controlled confrontation, he's setting himself up very badly in the event that he remains prime minister, which is a 50% possibility, for lack of any other figure, after the March 23rd election, because the bad blood that may be created, may be produced now, will just be another layer of animosity and toxicity that exists from 2015. And I say it again, don't forget who was the vice president in 2015. And don't misunderstand, and I know you won't, Amir. When Joe Biden says in a vice presidential debate in 2012, we and I have been friends. Okay, the things you say in a debate are not the things that you act on when you make policy. The things you say when you're a wannabe vice president are not the things that you say when you are the president of the United States. And thirdly, and most importantly, and this goes beyond the scope of this Zoom conversation or trialogue, the Netanyahu of 2012 is not the Netanyahu of 2021. The man has changed. The man has changed his behavior, his modus operandi. This is not the same guy that then Vice President Biden was referring to him to as my friend.
Yeah, Ellison, by the way, do you think this is something that Biden recognizes the change in Netanyahu that Alon describes?
Well, he's seen a lot of Netanyahu's over the years. So, I don't think that he's going to take any change too seriously. If we're walking down memory lane, if you want to rewind even before 2015, anyone who has a long memory can remember 2010, when as a relatively new vice president, Joe Biden came and visited Israel and was 90 minutes late to a dinner with the Netanyahus because of the decision of somebody in the Netanyahu government to time the announcement of new settlements just before he was about to meet with him, and it was very embarrassing incident. And Biden got up while he was in Israel and strongly condemned the settlement announcement. So, I think that I don't think that we're going to. Biden is going to take any sort of cosmetic changes in Netanyahu too seriously, but I think
they're not cosmetic, Allison. They are not cosmetic at all.
No.
The Netanyahu post 2015 election is a completely different political entity.
Yeah. So you think he's gonna hold his fire this time?
No.
No.
He won't. No.
Where
do you think a statement like the one that Amidro made 10 days ago, or the one that the chief of staff made today, is coming from? Instead of calling the president and saying, I have major reservations about the idea of going back to the JCPOA. Joe, you and I know each other for a long time. Mm-hmm. This is an issue that your failure is my failure. I don't want you to fail. Mm-hmm. I urge you, let's talk about this. I will come to DC quietly for one day, no media, no nothing. In about 10 days, I want to express to you in the sincerest and utmost seriousness what problems we may have with a new agreement based on the old agreement. Instead, he's doing the exact opposite. Instead of going and speaking with Biden, either via a secure phone or actually going there, he's sending all kind of proxies to threaten everyone. What is the point? I mean, does he really think that anyone in the world in general, but in the U.S. in particular, is going to appreciate a foreign policy crisis in the midst of a pandemic and economic depression? I mean, what the hell is his point, other than I need to win an election? It's not going well for me, but I do have one huge advantage over my rivals, and that is the perception that only I could deal adequately and skillfully with the U.S. president.
So taking on that point, Alon, of Netanyahu basically instead of doing this quiet outreach, let's assume that at some point Israel would come to the United States, not with this confrontational approach, but in the way that you described. I want both of you to try to explain. Alison, you can go first. What would Israel even ask the United States to do? Okay, we're against going back to the Iran deal. We don't want you to go back to the Iran deal. But what is the alternative? What would Israel be asking the United States then? Because you both describe a situation where the stakes are very high. If you don't go back to the agreement, you can really have a major crisis here with a country racing towards a nuclear weapons capability. So what would be the alternative? Alison, well, what would we even be suggesting?
I mean, presumably first of all, Israel is putting the military option on the table, I guess, in order to scare the United States in some sort of in some sort of tactical move, to move it to a negotiating position. But I mean, I would think being against any kind of agreement is. I think playing a card in a tactical way to get what everyone's saying. We want a longer and stronger agreement. We only want an agreement if it takes into account keeping Iranian proxies under control, if it includes ballistic missile capabilities and not only the nuclear issue. I guess taking a middle position between no negotiations, no agreement, and will only consider lifting sanctions if Iran agrees to this, the missiles issue and the proxy issue, and putting a lot of
So a different agreement is what you're saying, like an agreement,
Yeah.
but not this one.
New and improved 2.0. A 2.0
So Alon,
agreement.
my follow-up question to you, is that even possible?
No, it's not.
Probably
Look,
no,
we're-
it's not possible, but
we're-
it's a negotiable position.
No, it's
Yes.
not a negotiable position. Look, we're dwelling too much on what the U.S. will or will not do without knowing what exactly the thinking in Washington, D.C. right now is. I don't know what Anthony Blinken or Jake Sullivan or Rob Malley or indeed President Biden is actually thinking. Here's the thing. The agreement was never perfect, but the agreement was mischaracterized primarily by Israel as one that failed to deal with Iran's regional behavior. Well, hey, lo and behold, that was never the intent of the deal. The
Right.
deal was designed to curb Iran's nuclear capability. It did so. What actually failed was the US withdrawing and applying the so-called maximum pressure strategy. That yielded nothing. That only drove the Iranians, who are not easy clients to begin with, into a position of perpetual defiance. We'll show you. And they're being backed by China and Russia quietly. And the Germans, the French, and the British are all consumed logically and naturally by the coronavirus pandemic. So no one's really dealing with this. So going back to the agreement is quite impossible. Opening it up and saying, okay, we need to govern how Iran behaves. There is no agreement in history, no agreement between two countries in history that actually governed how a country behaves regionally. There's no such thing. What are you going to do? Who's going to define a violation, a breach, or incompliance or non-compliance? I'm sorry. Is it going to be Mr. Netanyahu? I mean, who's going to decide what's an acceptable regional behavior? Now, we all know who the Iranians are. By the way, when you said before, Emil, that they're rushing into or going quickly into nuclear development, weaponizing nuclear power mode. Look, they haven't done that since 2003. Let's not forget that. And I recall a conversation I was in the room between Prime Minister Ehud Barak and then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. And Barak said, well, according to our intelligence, the Iranians are about 2 to 3 years away from a military nuclear device. And she kind of rolled her eyes and said, for the last 15 years, I've been hearing that Iran is 2 to 3 years away. And I'm sure that for the next 10 years, I'll be hearing that they're 2 to 3. So at some point, you're going to be right.
But even she didn't think it would be that way 21 years later in 2021.
Exactly. Now, we're dissecting this without knowing three major things here. One is, what exactly is the thinking in the US? Is it going to be quietly going to the Iranian and saying, okay, we will lift some of the sanctions as a confidence building measure, but you in exchange come back to the negotiating table and we'll start with the JCPOA, but we will improve. Okay, that's one thing. The second thing we don't know is how Russia and China feel about this. And the third thing we don't know, I at least don't know, is what the Iranians think about this. Everyone said, maximum pressure, they'll crumble down, the Iranian economy will disintegrate. Okay, yeah, it's been very difficult for them, but they did not disintegrate and they did not collapse. And
they waited out Trump from their point of view.
Yes, they waited out Trump, even though they did something that they said they wouldn't, and that is breach the agreement by enriching more uranium. Actually, they now have 12 times enriched uranium than they had before. but they're not back to 2015 levels of nuclear development. Let's not forget that. And this, this the military option, and we'll do this, and it's a bad agreement. Let me remind you, and I'll stop with this because I'm talking too much. Let me remind you of one thing. In March 2015, Mr. Netanyahu, the epitome of this is 1938 and Iran is Hitler, went to Congress and said, "Don't nix it, fix it. We have a better agreement." So I ask a simple question to you two and to everyone who's watching us. Where is this better agreement? I haven't seen the text. A text does not exist. And anyways, a text should have been submitted to Obama when he was president in 2014. Not because it's all show, it's all pandering, it's all grandstanding.
I don't know. Alon, I have to stop you. The former president, Donald Trump, told Iran that they could have a wonderful deal if they would come and speak with him. It would be the greatest deal they ever had, much better than the deal they had with Obama. And maybe that's what it's about. All right, guys, we are approaching...
the century, maybe. But there's one thing that Alon didn't mention in his very excellent list of factors that we don't know about. We also don't know what President Biden's political considerations and weighing his priorities are, because he's aiming for bipartisanship of some kind. He's aiming to lure some Republicans over to his side on the really hot button issues in America right now, on economic stimulus, on fighting the coronavirus, etc. So Biden might not be so interested in in sparking some sort of immediate political confrontation with Israel, which has a lot of very strong supporters. Some in the Democratic Party, but a lot of war hawks in the Republican Party. And so Biden might also have an interest in not moving along at warp speed, to coin a phrase, towards renewing the JCPOA or some form of it.
I like the warp speed reference, right? Friends, we are approaching the time of the Q&A from our viewers. And this is again an opportunity to remind everyone, you are watching Zoom with Haaretz. We're having a special briefing here today about the Biden administration's dilemma on Iran with our great panelists, Alon Pincus and Ellison Kaplan-Sommer. And whether you're watching us via Zoom or Facebook Live, I encourage you to later go to Haaretz.com, subscribe, get writer alerts for both Ellison and Alon, so you can read all of their great texts and analysis. And you can also later watch our discussion online. Before we do move to questions from our viewers, and you can still submit those via the Q&A option on your screen. Ellison, I do want to touch on something that is not Iran related, because we have devoted 40 minutes now to the Iranian issue. You said earlier that this is not a top priority for Israelis in the election. So I do want to briefly ask you, and again, for some of our viewers, this might come as a surprise because this is such an existential issue, supposedly. And Netanyahu, when he appears abroad, always makes everything about Iran. What are the issues that Israelis care about more than the Iranian nuclear issue at the moment, when they are thinking who to vote for on March 23rd?
I think in the era of COVID-19, existential issue takes on a very different cast. Literally an existential issue, life and death. Netanyahu, just to clearly his ability to get so many Israelis vaccinated against the coronavirus is going to put a lot more supporters in his corner than standing up to Joe Biden on the Iran deal, for example. Somehow it's an impossibility, but somehow mitigating the economic damage of the coronavirus would get him more credit. But also, in looking at Netanyahu's the changes between 2015 and now, just with his corruption trials, et cetera, his credibility is vastly diminished than what it was when he made his famous speech in Congress. I mean, there are a lot of Israelis, not only on the left, also on the right, who really believe that all Netanyahu cares about, his number one priority, is not the country's safety, is not lives, is not, the things that are important to them, but it is saving himself. And therefore, anything
Speaking of existential,
literally, he puts the I in ideology. So even now, if he stands up and like makes some beautiful, confrontation and stand against the Iran nuclear agreement on behalf of saving Israel from nuclear disaster in Iran, there's going to be people who look at it and say like, oh yeah, he's doing it in order to avoid his trial. So it's not a priority right now when we're in such dire health and economic straits. And B, with the diminished credibility, with the demonstrations multiple times a week against Netanyahu, I don't think that whatever he does on Iran is going to impress a majority of the voters.
Alon, a very quick question, and please a quick answer so we can move on to our viewer questions. But connecting to what Ellison described, what the election stakes are, how much does it hurt Netanyahu that Donald Trump is no longer in the White House as we are heading into this Israeli election?
Ordinarily, I'd say it would potentially hurt him. But because the election is essentially about yes, no, Mr. Netanyahu, and the issues are the coronavirus and the economy and a relevant and interlocking issue, the ultra-Orthodox community, and how they built a city-state within a state, and this overflowing anger and frustration with them from the non-Haredi communities. I think that the issue of Trump that would have hurt him otherwise is not a major factor. It's by the way, it's a factor in his relations with Democrats in the U.S. going back to the beginning of our conversation. But in terms of the election here, unless he goes for confrontation with Biden, which could hurt him. But again, on the margins, the election is not about that.
Okay. Thank you, Alon and Ellison, for a great discussion up to this point. We have many, many questions from our viewers on Zoom and on Facebook. Thank you to everyone who submitted. I will not be able, obviously, to ask all of the questions to Alon and Ellison, so I apologize if your question was left out, but we do have some great materials here. First of all, there is a question here that Ellison, you can start with it, and Alon, you can then answer. And please, guys, keep it shorter on the viewer questions. Is there any kind of agreement that Israel would support? Asks one of our viewers. And we talked about this issue of a better deal, and Alon said I've never seen it. So, Ellison, what is your take? Do you think there is a deal Netanyahu would actually support, or it's all about basically an excuse for resisting what exists?
No, there's a fantasy deal that he would support. I think, all those things thrown into the mix that he claims that he wants. I don't think he would stand up and oppose, an agreement in which Iran commits to rein in Hamas and Hezbollah and commits to not produce missiles. I think he would be fine with that. I don't know, Alon, am I being naive here?
No, not at all. Look, a lot of the things that Mr. Netanyahu said throughout the years about Iran are true. A lot of the reservations that he had about the JCPOA are on the point. The thing is, it was all about grandstanding. It was never backed up by policy. It was never crafted as a way to influence the decision inside the Obama White House at the time in 2014 and 15. I'm sorry, I take him seriously in what he says about the dangers, about the shortcomings, about the flaws. I do not at all take him seriously when he says that there is another agreement, and I completely agree with Ellison that this is, in his mind there is a fantasy agreement, the same one, by the way, that exists with the Palestinians in his mind, that he thinks everyone is going to accept. Look, for him, it's a toy. It's something to play with for years, and it sustained him politically. And it would have been the #1 issue had it not been for Corona.
Okay, we have a question here relating to Chief of Staff Kochavi's statement, and Alon, you were quite critical of it, and we have a question. Can't one argue that with Iran's ballistic missiles excluded from the JCPOA and Israel not being at the table, that, you know, there is a place also for the IDF to register a view on this, just like Iranian generals regularly make threatening statements on these very same issues.
That's who we're comparing ourselves to.
Yeah, you know, when we have a revolutionary guard, I will not object to its commanders expressing their opinions on foreign policy. Look, the points, whomever
aside from the Iranian comparison,
right.
I mean, the IDF also needs to speak out on this.
The IDF spoke for the agreement at the time in 2015. The IDF and the Mossad and others have all supported the agreement. No one said it was great. No one said it was perfect, but they supported the agreement. It was Netanyahu who has the authority and the prerogative to oppose it, despite what the army or the military said. He was the one who opposed it then and ever since. Yes, they have a duty. They have a duty to register their criticism and reservations to Netanyahu, or having his authority to their counterparts in the US. It is not, and again, I qualify this, I have not heard Mr. Kochavi, Lieutenant General Kochavi, that is, say this in his own voice. Assuming this is an accurate quote, that he thinks it's a very bad idea to go back, to revert to the JCPOA. Assuming he said that
in
is
Haaretz, he's quoted as saying it would be the wrong thing to do. Wrong thing is a quote.
Fine. Quoted as saying. I haven't, again.
So what you're saying, Alon, is his place is to say it to the Prime Minister or to the President of Israel or to the Knesset Committee on Security and Foreign Affairs, not in a speech.
He needs to do the following. I mean, I'm not advising the Chief of Staff, and I don't think he did it on his own volition. But the chain of command is as follows. He decides that this is a bad deal based on intelligence and assessments and so on and so forth. He then goes to the defense minister. We have a defense minister. People forget that because of the election, but Benny Gantz is still the defense minister. He then asks the defense minister to register his reservations to the prime minister. Yeah, I know this, but this is how it should work. If the defense minister does not do that, because unlike the US, the basic law of the army basically essentially says that, unlike the US where there's a commander-in-chief, the basic law of the army from 1976 essentially stipulates that the government is in charge of the military, not via the good services of the defense minister. He does not answer only to the defense minister. So Lieutenant General Kochavi is welcome to go to Mr. Netanyahu, the prime minister, and say, look, I feel so bad about this. This is so dangerous. This is so perilous. This is so irreversible if this happens that we must warn them now. The natural thing to do would be to summon himself to a meeting with, as I said 45 minutes ago, and this is the beginning of the discussion, to go to see General Maley in Washington.
Yeah.
If that doesn't work, if all that has been exhausted, then stand up and say, Masada will not fall again. Fine. Until then, what? He's beginning the dialogue by making a public statement. Imagine him saying, I think it's a very good idea to go back to the JCPOA. Can you imagine Mr. Netanyahu's reaction to that?
That would make for interesting headlines on Haaretz for sure. A question that comes from another viewer, this one to you, Ellison. How is the normalization between Israel and the Gulf Arab states impacting this conversation we're having on Biden, Iran, and Israel?
I think presumably it has an impact because it was in the past, back in 2015, you had publicly, at least, Israel and the Gulf nations both standing against the agreement or standing against Iran, but they were, standing not alongside each other. They were doing it separately, and now you've got them sort of as a united force. So I think that's going to have more impact and have more of an effect.
And we did see today Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi having some kind of a Zoom conversation, not as good as this Zoom briefing, but some kind of Zoom conversation with the foreign ministers of the two countries. So you're saying you could see them, Alison, doing some kind of a public united front, or do you think that when push comes to shove, Israel will be more, confrontational than these Arab states that also really rely on Washington?
No, I think that a lot of the Arab states are now ready to step up. Listen, they are, none of them are led by Benjamin Netanyahu, right? Like, they are definitely much more diplomacy oriented. They're doing it much more in the ideal way that Alon describes of, going to the right officials and having closed door meetings and putting that quiet pressure on them. So it's not in the same style, but I do think that they're going to be, I think a lot, also because they're a lot more scared of Iran now than they were then too. But I think they'll be, especially because of these agreements, that it will be more public and it will be more of a united front with the Israelis.
Alon, a question to you from one of our viewers. Why can't Israel just accept that Iran will have a nuclear program under the supervision of the United Nations?
For a variety of reasons. Because Iran is neither Sweden nor Belgium. And it aspires, it's ostensibly, it has vowed to use this against Israel. Do I think that's realistic? No. Do I think that the retribution might be tenfold worse for them? I do. But at least they have made this public. And the idea that Iran gains a nuclear weapon, which, by the way, for years people have been saying they might buy one from the Pakistanis, which was nonsense. But if Iran has one, then conceivably Saudi Arabia will want one, and Egypt would want one. So this is a bad development any way you look at it, not just from a theoretical political science or international relations anti-proliferation point of view, but from a very practical policy point of view. The type of regime that exists in Iran is nothing short than Islamofascism. That they are less harmful than we like to attribute to them is only because they're incapable of being more harmful than we know. And I honestly think that allowing them to have such a weapon under supervision of whomever is not going to cut it. By the way, they know that, which is why since 2003, they basically always strove to put themselves to position themselves, as a threshold or turnkey state, not going all the way and actually showing a device, displaying a device.
And that's not even close to the U.S. position as well. When Blinken was testifying in his confirmation hearing, he said, quote, "I think we have an urgent responsibility to do whatever we can to prevent Iran from acquiring or creating a weapon or getting close to the capacity for breaking out on short notice." So, America and Israel are in line with that. They agree on that. The question is, how do you do it?
Yep. Good point. Alison, a question I want to refer to you. How would Israel be affected by the new Democratic majority in the Senate? Another big change that happened in the election, not just Biden replacing Trump, but also Chuck Schumer now majority leader instead of Mitch McConnell.
Well, for one thing, they can't do what they did in 2015, and that's invite Netanyahu to get up there and speak. I think, the fact that the Democrats are in control really limits the amount that Israel could potentially play the legislative branch against the executive branch. It makes it completely impossible. So that's one major tool out of Netanyahu's toolbox to fight this agreement.
Mm-hmm. It's a good point. Another question here has to do actually with the issue of the next U.S. ambassador to Israel. Let's have it in two batches. Ellison, who are the main contenders you're hearing about? And then Alon, I want you to talk about what this person's main challenges are going to be.
Oh, I wish I had all of the names on the tip of my my tongue. There's, you know, I can look them up. Alon, you go first, and I'll look up the
Okay.
names that I remember.
We'll do it in that order. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so here goes at the risk of alienating some people. I will mention the names. At least 3 of them are very good friends of mine, and this is where I'm going to alienate them. It's no longer an important job. It has no challenges. It has no influence. It has very little impact. So, how do you want to proceed from here, Amir?
Why is it that you're saying that, you know, it's not an important? Because some people would definitely disagree.
I welcome a debate with those people. I'm raising my hand and showing you this device, an iPhone or Galaxy. This changed the role of ambassadors. In other words, communications, the readily available types of communications, including secure communications. The idea that a prime minister can call a president anytime if it's urgent, or a foreign minister can call a secretary of state, or head of Mossad can call a CIA and go over the heads of ambassadors. Now, some ambassadors wield bigger power, some less power. It depends on what they are entrusted to do. If it's about gathering information, there's very little information that you need to be in Israel to gather that you can't do in DC. And by the way, vice versa. When you're an Israeli ambassador in DC, yes, it's very important to talk to all the staffers on the intelligence committee. Yes, it's very important to schmooze with the deputy head of the CIA or the assistant secretary for military political. Okay, that's fine. But the bulk of the information is available without that person. It's not the era when an ambassador, when the ambassador of Great Britain to Turkey was effectively a foreign minister vis-a-vis Turkey, or the ambassador of Israel in Paris was conveying major policy decisions, or the Israeli ambassador to DC, or the American ambassador here. It's just, you know, look, if there is friction between the prime minister and the president, there's very little an ambassador could do to alleviate or soothe these tensions. If there's no friction and no strain, then who needs the ambassador? Everything's working, right? So I know I'm oversimplifying things. I'm not saying you don't need ambassadors. I'm just saying the roles have changed.
That would really cut you out of the entire diplomatic corps in the whole world if you say that you don't need ambassadors at all. I mean, what's your language there?
Who's going to go to cocktail parties?
Nah, the cocktail parties is a bullshit thing from the night. Excuse my French. Is a nonsense thing from the 70s. And you know, when people used to cable back, I met the deputy cultural attaché of the Bulgarian embassy in Brussels. Very interesting gentleman. His daughter is very high up in the Bulgarian women's division of the youth communist movement. Who cares? This is what people used to do. This doesn't matter anymore.
Okay, the short list. I've refreshed myself on the short list.
Let's go.
You know,
who are the after Alon told us why they are so unimportant? Who are the people that might be lucky enough?
So
I don't know. I just, you know.
No, wait, Elisa, who are the people on our list?
Okay, so it was people, the big rumor was Congressman Steve Israel, but he pulled himself out of contention. The guy who really wants it, who's doing like a press blitz of, you know, me, is this guy, Michael Adler, who's a Miami-based real estate developer and Democratic Party donation bundler, you know, one of those
big Biden donor, right?
Ambassadors. And Amos Hochstein, who, or in American, Amos Hochstein, who worked on Middle East issues on Capitol Hill in the State Department and was a mediator between Lebanon and Israel at one point. And your friend and mine, the former ambassador in the Obama administration, Daniel Shapiro. There have been, very consistent rumors that Dan Shapiro could come back for another stint as ambassador. And also rumored is, or another person who wants it is former Congressman Robert Wexler from Florida.
Well,
So,
with Shapiro, that at least would save the flight ticket, right? Because he's here. I think
yeah, he's already here.
A neighbor of yours in Ra'anana, right?
Yeah, also in Ra'anana is former ambassador to Costa Rica, Fitz Haney, who also happens to live in Israel, who's African-American, who's married to a conservative rabbi. So he would also be a very interesting choice.
Or maybe you added someone to the shortlist. All right, friends, we are about to run. We've actually run past the hour, but we still have a lot of viewers and some questions. So we'll take one or two more final questions. And again, thank you to everyone who joined. And as I said earlier, you can also watch this later on our website, subscribe, and get rider alerts for Alon and Ellison. So I guess the last questions we will take from this wonderful list here. Or this, Alon, you're gonna like this one. But again, guys, please, short answers. Pakistan is the world's second largest Sunni country and is nuclear armed. Iran shares a tense border with Pakistan. Why is it always about Israel when we talk about the Iran nuclear issue?
That's a very good question. In fact, in the late 80s and moving into the mid 90s, the thinking in the Israeli intelligence and diplomatic community was that Iran's efforts to develop a military nuclear option was actually against Pakistan and not against Israel because of the exporting the revolution strain in Iranian ideology, in the Mullah ideology. Israel had to be the little Satan, backed by the big Satan, the US. But the strategic rationale was against Pakistan. There's maybe that's true. I don't know. I've never spoken to the great leader in Iran, or to the late Qasem Soleimani. I'm sorry. I don't know what their thinking was. I haven't seen any indication or evidence in Iranian foreign policy thinking, and I do follow it. I'm not an expert, but I do follow it quite closely. I haven't seen any evidence that this is about confronting a Pakistani threat, but particularly with Pakistan having India to deal with. But I understand the question, and it's been puzzling some of us here in Israel too.
Yep, there's been a lot of media rumors that one of the next countries to normalize with Israel could be Pakistan. In relation to that.
That's true. We've covered this in Haaretz, and that would actually be an interesting development if we talk about.
Yeah, except that you all made it up. There's absolutely no proof of that. You just assumed it was the inconceivable. It's not inconceivable nature of a lot in the Israeli press. It's not inconceivable that Pakistan is next. So let's write it up and see what happens.
Well, there supposedly were secret visits by Pakistani envoys visiting Israel. So unless they made those up too.
If you are interested in this issue,
Alison, I met the Pakistani foreign minister with Shimon Peres in the 90s. Big deal.
Okay.
Is there an agreement between Israel and Pakistan? No.
Guys, we really have to get to the end. So, Ellison, the last and final question, it will go to you. Are there voices in Israel, in the political arena, in the security arena, who challenge the position that Netanyahu and today also Kochavi present on Iran? This is the last viewer question. And thank you to all of the viewers who submitted. And I apologize to those who their question was not asked.
Not very many in terms of opposing an agreement. Some on style. We've had a very weird statement by our what's it called? Our alternate
prime minister. Yeah.
Benny
Oh,
Gantz.
he's called the spare.
Spare prime minister. And what did he say?
Yeah, in which he said that he has close personal ties with Biden, and the Biden administration is pro-Israel, and will find a sympathetic ear, and in which he doesn't want to use all sorts of tricks and bypassing measures that endanger us, which is very odd. So he's not opposing the opposition to the nuclear deal, but he is opposing the Netanyahu style of opposing it.
So basically saying we need to work with Biden and not work against Biden on this issue.
Exactly, but even back in 2015, we hard pressed to find a very vocal person in favor of the JCPOA. There were on the left edge of the political spectrum in Israel some, but even
there were many. Most heads of Mossad and chiefs of staff supported.
He said political. We were talking about the politicians.
Yeah, but in the defense establishment, it's a different view. Back then, at least, we heard Kochavi tonight presenting something different. All right, friends, I would love to continue the discussion, but we are almost 10 minutes past our ending time. Thank you so much to Ellison and Alon for a great discussion, a lot of illuminating points and stuff to think about. Thank you to all of our viewers who stayed with us till the very end, and to all the great questions. Again, please go to Haaretz.com, subscribe, get writer alerts for Alon and Ellison so you can enjoy their wonderful writing, their great stories and analysis. And stay alert because we will have more Zooms with Haaretz soon on the big news here in Israel and in the United States. Thank you so much and goodbye now.